Iran in just a second. Before I do, I just want to pick up on the story there in the headlines. Donald Trump. Just a quick reflection from you, Mark. He says, by the way, he's been politically persecuted.
Yeah, I've got a little bit of sympathy with that. Look, Donald Trump's a pretty hard man to warm to, I think. But how many cases have we got against him now? Is it over 90 or something? And my worry is this. Are we now experiencing what they call modern lawfare? That's to say that the law is no longer above politics and neutral and trying to get to the truth. It's used by one political side to persecute another political side. So I don't know whether Donald Trump's done anything wrong, but I'm highly suspicious that his political opponents are using the judicial process to try and knock him out.
Do you want him to be the next president?
If the choice is him or Biden, the devil or the deep blue sea, I'd pick the devil.
Ella Whelan, your thoughts?
I don't think even a gun to my head could make me pick between the two of them. But I agree with Mark that, when these cases were first announced, in this kind of press release, one of the top lawyers made a big deal out of the Capitol riots and the supposed threats to democracy for all of that, which has got nothing to do with many of these cases. And that I think that was a glaring admission of saying this is political. It is about trying to bring Trump down through the courts. And it's a terrible, terrible thing for democracy because, well, number one, it'll only boost his campaign, I think. And number two, it's, as Mark says, kind of lawfare and a really undemocratic way of approaching politics, which is that judges somewhere else will decide who's the next president rather than American citizens.
Indeed. Does it put you off Trump? Are you a supporter of Trump? Does it just make you more compelled to back him? Could you care less, quite frankly, who the next US president is or not? You should do, because we do seem to follow them like lapdogs when it comes to our foreign policy sometimes, doesn't it? Which leads me nicely onto the story that I want to cover top of the show today. Many of the front pages in this country, of course, leading with this to speak about the situation when it comes to Iran and Israel. Let me cross live now to our home and security editor, Mark White. Good evening to you. Mark, just in case people have had other things to do with their weekend as opposed to following the goings-on in the Middle East, can you just bring people up to speed with what's actually happened, please?
From Iran to airstrikes that took place on the 1st of April against a compound next to the Iranian embassy in the Syrian capital, Damascus, which killed a number of top Iranian generals. Iran viewed that as a direct attack on its sovereign territory and vowed revenge. And we got that on Saturday night in the form of hundreds of ballistic missiles, cruise missiles and drones that were launched from Iran towards Israel. The vast majority, thankfully, were shot down before they even got towards Israeli airspace. But this was unprecedented. The first time that Iran has ever launched a direct attack on Israel from its sovereign soil. Of course, Iran has been behind many attacks on Israel over the years, but normally through its proxies in the region. And that, from the likes of southern Lebanon or from Gaza or from the Yemen has caused untold damage to Israel over the years. But this, as I say, is a departure, the first time that a direct attack was launched from Iran on Israel.
And so tell me then, how was the UK? Well, what was the response and how involved was the UK in that response, Mark?
Well, the UK was involved to a limited degree. We had combat jets in the form of Typhoon jets that are part of Operation Shader. Now, you might remember that during the height of Islamic State, Daesh, the UK government calls them, that terror group based out of Syria and Iraq, we set up Operation Shader along with the US and other allies. In other words, we were patrolling the airspace over Iraq and Syria and still to this day targeting extremist sites in those two countries. And as part of Operation Shader, the government signalled and gave the permission to those patrols in that area that if these drones or missiles came into their area of responsibility, then they had the permission to shoot down these drones and missiles headed for Israel. And they did that. We're told about a dozen drones were taken out by these Typhoon aircraft. And now, as a consequence of that as well, the UK has enhanced the number of combat jets, sending more combat jets that would be based out of Cyprus, along with supporting tanker aircraft. So a ratcheting up of the UK response here, because there is the potential, of course, for more strikes to be launched if this situation escalates in the coming hours and days.
I mean, Rishi Sunak as well, he's been speaking in Parliament about this today, Mark. He says, our aim, the UK's aim, is to support stability and security because that is right for the region. And he goes on to say, all of this has a direct effect on our security and our prosperity at home. I mean, absolutely it will. If this escalates and we end up with some kind of regional war in the Middle East, if anyone's tuning in and thinking, Michelle, why are you talking about Israel and Iran? How does that affect life in the UK? It very much will, won't it, Mark?
Well, certainly the hope from Western allies is that Israel will listen and that any response will be limited and something that Iran can deal with and not lose face and feel that it has to launch a very significant missile and drone strike again at Israel, because then we are in very, very dangerous territory, a downward spiral to a regional conflict. And you're absolutely right, Michelle, that a regional war would really have severe implications for people right here in the UK, because it would without doubt push the oil price up. The oil price already rose quite significantly in expectation of what was to happen at the weekend. Following that attack, though, it hasn't risen. It's slightly reduced, actually, to, I think, $91 per barrel of crude oil. But if things were to deteriorate, the oil price would absolutely escalate, and that would have a knock-on effect on everything here in terms of fuel prices that we have, the prices in the shops and the like as well. A lot of the difficulties, the sort of the financial crisis that we had here, the cost of living crisis, was driven by the hike in oil prices after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So some real concerns. You've got aviation as well, which of course is being badly impacted. Commercial airlines that are having to reroute away from the most dangerous areas. That adds thousands of extra pounds to the costs of fueling those aircraft. That again has an impact on ticket prices.
Interesting stuff. Mark White, thank you for bringing everyone up to speed on that one. I've got to say, sometimes, you know, the goings on in the Middle East, it can seem quite complicated and overwhelming. And I think that point now, that key point at the end that we're talking about here, this will have very, very real impacts on the UK, on everyone's standard of life. We've just been touching on there, whether it's your price you pay at the pumps, whether it's the price you're ultimately going to pay for food and all the rest of it. What do you think the UK should be doing, if anything, in this situation?
I think at the moment the UK is doing the right thing. And you're quite right, Michelle. I mean, a major conflict anywhere on the globe has ripple effects right across the globe. There might be 200 or so independent nations, but we're all interlinked. It seems so far the UK's involvement, whilst minimal, was actually to help knock these ballistic missiles and drones out of the sky. And the fact that I think there was a 99% plus success rate in stopping them getting through, in small part down to British forces, probably helps this, prevents this from escalating. Let's hope so, because if we can, both diplomatically and through the deployment of our military resources, prevent an escalation, well, good on us. And it's not just a good thing for mankind, it's good in our own interests as well for the reasons that you've just pointed out.
Indeed, Ella?
I agree with that, but I think there's a limit to understanding this simply as a sort of way of ensuring domestic sort of measures and protections. David Cameron was all over the airwaves this morning talking about the fact that we should care about this because it puts shipping at risk. You're talking about the Houthis, which is true, and it's an important point. But I actually think Sunak was stronger in his speech where, you know, he said we must ensure Israel's security, that is non-negotiable, which is reminding, I suppose, the nation of really what's at stake here, which is it's not just a bit like the Ukraine-Russia war. It's not just a matter of sort of keeping our fuel supplies running and sort of keeping the country ticking over. There are big existential questions at play here about solidarity with national sovereignty, about, for example, let's not forget that, October the 7th, of the protection of Jewish people against a death cult, an anti-Semitic death cult. All of this is relevant to us because it should be relevant to us. We should care about, for example, what happens with the rise of Islamist sentiments in the Middle East. And actually, it's interesting. Yesterday, after the events of the weekend, some top Israeli officials, the defence minister, Yoav Gallant, came out and said, well, why don't we have an international coalition? If it, I think actually... Who knows? But I think it was surprising to a lot of people that there was such a coalition against these drone strikes. You had Jordanian forces shooting down missiles, French, British, US. Yeah. And, Israel has come out and said, well, why don't we formalise this in some kind of international coalition? Now, there's pros and cons to that. Obviously, that might in itself entail some form of escalation. But I think that there is a sort of, to come back to the sort of existential point, there is a question about any future in which Islamist tendencies are allowed, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, the Houthis are allowed to continue to grow in the Middle East, or whether there should be some kind of international effort to ideologically oppose that. And that matters to us, not just because there are Islamist attacks and threats here, but because we should care what happens on the world stage.